Good morning again, and good morning to those who are streaming with this morning. We have today a profoundly deep mystical teaching from Jesus, and I will do my best to explain it, but I ask that the grace of God might be present with all of us as we seek to understand what our spiritual master is saying to us. So, let's start with Jesus himself. Jesus was a fully unified human being. He was fully unified with himself. Jesus was not fractured by his ego as the rest of us are, and as we understand ego as it's explained by Freud in the world of thinking about how we think. And the reason that Jesus transcended the issues of the ego and is fully unified with himself is that Jesus is fully unified with the divine. And we hear that in today's scripture, if we have ears to hear, where we get the seventh and the last of Jesus's so-called I am statements in the gospel according to John. So when Jesus says I am, it's not like I'm saying I am Peter Walsh. When Jesus says I am the true vine, that I am, ego eimi, in the Greek, echoes the book of Exodus story where Moses meets God at the burning bush and asks for God's name, and it comes back, I am. And this note that when Jesus says I am, he is saying that he is unified and participates in the divine nature. And so we get this in other places, I am in the Father and the Father's in me. And Jesus gets his whole identity, he gets his whole purpose, and he gets his whole energy system from the divine. That's how he lives his life. And his relationship with who he calls Father or Abba, which is, as you know, is intimate, is not a relationship to God far out in the heavens. When Jesus is referring to the Father, he is not referring to a long distance phone call. That it's all integrated. So he is integrated with himself. He is unified with the Father, and he is completely unified with all human beings. And this is where we get the title Son of Man and the human being. And we can see Jesus living out his identity with every human being, as Jesus always seeks out and defends those who are cast out by the society that he lives in, and those who are cast out by every society. Jesus is always for the oppressed. Nothing could be farther than the way of Jesus, than the political discourse of our country, where people take a political stand as their identity and then vilify others. This is and would be an anathema to Jesus. So Jesus is also completely unified with creation. And we see this when he walks on water. We see this when he stills the storm. So we have in Jesus unified in himself, unified with God, unified with all humanity, and unified with all creation. In Jesus, there is no duality, what is known as duality or dual thinking. There is no I versus the other, or I in relationship with the other. There is only you wouldn't even use the other. The other is part of him. It's completely unified. God, all people, all of creation is part of who he is, as he is part of all of the so-called others. Okay, so that's Jesus. Now let's talk about those of us who are followers of Jesus. And what is Christian spirituality? Hebraic spirituality, Christian spirituality, Islamic spirituality, Buddhist spirituality, Hindu spirituality. There's many, many crossovers, but they're also very distinctly different. We can learn from all of these spiritualities, for truth is truth, and Jesus says he is the truth. So any of these spiritualities can teach us about the divine. But there is particularity in the Christian spiritual tradition, and the particularity flows from Jesus himself. Christian spirituality is based on the idea and the spiritual reality that Jesus is inviting us to participate in his spirituality. That's what we're doing. We are participating in him. And in the short pericope or passage that Father John just read to us, we get "in me" 6 times, and 3 times we get "in you." And next week you're going to get it again, because we're going to finish the passage. Jesus is inviting us into the unified communion that he experiences with the divine, that he experiences in himself, that he experiences with all of humanity and with all of creation. And Christian mystical spirituality is when that union and communion begins to be realized in our lives by the gift of grace. And that is what Jesus is teaching about us, teaching to us today. The Pew Research poll tells us, and it has told us this over time, that just over half of people who live in the United States have had a mountaintop experience. And that means half of us. It'd be really funny if we could, I won't have you hold up your hand, but if we could all like, oh, did you have one of these? And for all those of you who've had one of these, you know that one experiences a sublime oneness with all things, a profound sense of belonging, and a profound sense that everything belongs. You belong with everything. It is profoundly peaceful. There is no chaos, no confusion, no anxiety. You feel refreshed and energized by it. You have, in one of these experiences, a sense that everything makes sense. Okay, let's talk about the fall, which is on the bottom of our reredos. The story of the fall in the book of Genesis is about separation. That's what the story's about. And in the story, we get separation from God. Remember, Adam and Eve get kicked out of the garden, so they lose intimacy with God. It's about separation in humanity. Their son Cain kills their other son Abel, and we get separation from creation. Remember in the garden that they're just picking the fruit, but when they get kicked out of the garden, the curse is that they have to till the soil that is filled with brambles. And so in the symbolic story of the fall, we get the loss of oneness, we get the loss of the unitive experience of reality, we get isolation, we get the ego, and we get duality. We get I versus the other as we start to experience ourselves as isolated from others. Jesus, who is the greatest human being to ever have lived, transcends every description. Any description you have of Jesus, there's more. You can never sum this man up. And his transcendent self that has no ego transforms separation into unity. That's what's happening in Jesus. And in other words, in Paul's understanding, he's undoing the fall. That's why Paul calls him the new Adam. In the gospel, which starts in, as you know, John's gospel starts not in the Sea of Galilee, but on the shores of the Jordan, in what would be Jordan today. And the first followers, inquire, and he says, come and see. And so we have moved from come and see all the way to this great mystical teaching. And what he is teaching us is how to live our lives in a way as though we were always having a mountaintop experience. That's what he is telling us. And in the spiritual life, all spiritual lives are marked by different movements, and there's at least 3 basic ones, and I happen to be a great fan of Evelyn Underhill, the great Anglican mystic and scholar of the mystical life, naming 5 movements. And the first being awakening. And awakening is we sometimes call it conversion. It's the understanding that there is a divine dimension that in our humanity we were unaware of, and that all of a sudden we are aware of it. Well, suddenly, or it can happen gradually, but our horizon moves to a divine horizon beyond our humanity. And then there's a movement that is called purgation, and purgation is about reorienting the way we live our lives so that we can move toward that horizon. It means we cast off certain things, we develop certain ways of being, spiritual disciplines, in order to orient our consciousness toward the divine horizon. And the third movement is known as illumination. And in illumination, we begin to receive gifts from the divine, not of our own making. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound, would be an example of a movement of illumination where this is John Newton's conversion, but where the gift of grace comes from the beyond. The fourth movement is known as the dark night of the soul, named after John of the Cross's great poem, and which is in the ultimate purgation. And then the fifth movement is the unitive life, union, which is what Jesus is helping us with this morning. And he says to us, "Abide in me as I abide in you." And those of you who saw the podcast will remember my saying that this is the Greek word meno, which means abide or remain or stay, tarry or dwell, to turn aside from a journey, to remain in place, to seek shelter. And that Eugene Peterson, the author of that wonderful translation called The Word, translated into contemporary parlance, says, "Live in me, make your home in me just as I do in you." So, abide in the abode of God. The basic spiritual teaching about the vine, the branches, and the fruit is simply stay connected. Stay connected, because when you stay connected, there is a flow, divine flow, just like the sap in the vine. It's just stay connected. But the mystical teaching is about oneness, the oneness of the vine, the branch, and the fruit. So when we abide, let me start over. There's a great story. A story, Richard Rohr, the great spiritual light, the Franciscan from New Mexico, tells a wonderful story about giving a series of lectures at the Abbey of Gethsemane, where Thomas Merton lived, and at the end of it, the abbot asks, Richard, what can we do to say thank you? And Richard is a pro-Franciscan, he can't take any money. He said, well, I would like to live in Thomas Merton's hermitage for a month. And he said, oh, fine, just tell us when. And he arrived to go live in the hermitage, and just before he went out, the abbot said to him, I just want to warn you, there's a few guys living in the woods. They're recluses. They only come in for midnight mass on Christmas, and they come in for the Easter vigil, but besides the rest of the time, they live in the woods. And he tells the story of walking down the path in the woods one day, and he bumps into the minorly famous Father Flavian, who used to be the abbot of Gethsemane. And they're walking down the path, and Father Flavian says to him, Richard! And Richard is dumbfounded that he knows his name. And he comes up to him and he says, Richard, I live in the woods, and I don't talk to anybody, but you talk to everybody. You travel the world. Everybody, you go. He said, please, for me, give them one message, and it's God is not out there. And then he said, good day, and he hit the road. That is the question of how we abide in God. We are not abiding in a God that is out there. We are abiding in a God that is in here. When you meditate, Christian meditation, there are many techniques, but it's all the same. It's about abiding in the inner abode where the divine rests and lives within us. Jesus' teaching goes on. He removes every branch in me that bears no fruit. Every branch that bears fruit he prunes to make it bear more fruit. You have already been cleansed by the word that I have spoken to you. Again, if you heard the pod, you heard some of this. The word that we translate as prune is not really the word prune. In the Greek, it is the word kathairo, which means to cleanse. It's the word for purification that is used at the temple for the cultic purification, so that those coming to meet God can meet the divine presence. They have to be purified to meet the pure. And then he goes on to say, Jesus that is, whoever does not abide in me is thrown away like a branch and withers. Such branches are gathered and thrown into the fire and burned. As the Tao of Christ points out, this is not a passage about going to hell. It's not a threat, it's a promise. And really what it is, it's about throwing out all of those things that are in us that make our life like hell. That's what he's talking about, burning. And so when Jesus says, my Father is the vine dresser, the cultivator of the vine, what he is talking about here is the casting out of the ego, or the casting away of dead religion, religious practices, points of view, mental dispositions of our heart that keep us from the divine. There is, as you know, the via positiva, which is the positive steps we take in order to be in touch with the divine. You're all doing it today. I mean, you're in church or you're streaming church. You're taking action to stay in touch. But there is also the via negativa, the negative way, and the negative way is the spiritual way in which we cast out all of those things in our thinking, in our dispositions that keep us from divine communion and union. A lot written about this. One of the great books, The Ascent of Mount Carmel by John of the Cross, and where he reviews the things that have to be thrown out as you ascend to the heights of the holy mountain. And anybody who's done any backpacking knows about this. Some of you have heard my talk about my sabbatical, and I gave it twice, so I'm not quite sure what I said, but in one of them, I certainly did say that I chose to put my laptop in my backpack because I really hadn't planned much of what was coming. And so when I was with Mark Thorsheim, climbing for hours upon hours what seemed to me straight up, that computer, which doesn't weigh a thing, but if you put it in your backpack and you climb straight up for hours on end, it weighs tons. And that is what it is like with our spiritual lives. We carry tons of garbage in our backpacks as we seek to ascend to divine union and communion, that which we were created for. And Paul tells us this. You're going to recognize this from Philippians. Paul says, I regard everything as loss because of the surpassing value of knowing Christ Jesus, my Lord. For his sake, I have suffered the loss of all things, and I regard them as rubbish in order that I might gain Christ. Now, those of you who are biblical wizards, you know that the word rubbish is sometimes translated as garbage, but the real word there is excrement. Paul is dropping the S word right into one of his great letters, which I love because I have a hard time with cussing. He is throwing out everything that would get in the way of his union and communion with the divine. That is what the vine dresser is pruning. And we are all to be pruned and purified because none of us can get to this union by ourselves without the vine dresser. Okay, what happens, just a sense of this, what happens when you make the journey by the grace of God? What is this unitive life like? And here, I just, yesterday afternoon, took a few bites and pieces out of an incredible book by Evelyn Underhill, the great Anglican mystic and scholar of mysticism. And she's describing the unitive way. She says, first of all, people who live in this way have a transcendent vitality. And you all know of, if you don't know, you see some people have a vitality that is otherworldly. It's shocking. It's shocking. We see this in the people, the so-called people we call the saints. They just have this crazy energy. They are plugged into a different energy system. It is a divine energy system. And one of the reasons they're plugged into that divine system is they have completely surrendered the self. They are no longer occupied with internal conversations about how am I doing, or how does this other person think I'm doing. Do they like me? Do I like them? I'm judging them. They're judging me. Zip, gone. All that stuff that we waste time over. There is a complete unification of the personality in the immersion of God. And these people's lives, they become ambassadors for the absolute. They participate in eternal life. This is the prayer attributed to St. Francis. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. That is the world these people live in. They have a sense of completely unbounded freedom of life. John's gospel is the gospel of life. And this is the life that John is talking about. There is a life out there that is so powerful as to make the rest of your hair fall out, right? And we get this in Paul. Paul says, not I, but Christ within me. Mary and Martha combined, because when this unity that Jesus is seeking to bring us to, we live plugged in to the ground of being, what Paul Tillich called the ground of being. We are plugged into the divine. There is not the mediator of our thoughts and sensibilities, of our theological understandings, of our judgments. Jesus says, do not judge. It goes away, and we live in complete communion with ourselves, with the divine, with all of our siblings, all of humanity, and all of creation.